Hello and welcome to the history of the USS Maine. The USS Maine BB-10 was the lead ship of her class of the pre-dreadnought battleships. She was the second ship of the United States Navy to be named in the honor of the 23rd state. Maine was laid down in February 1899 at the William Cramp Sons shipyards in Philadelphia. She was launched in July 1901 and commissioned into the fleet in December 1902. She was armed with a main battery of four 12-inch guns and could steam at a top speed of 18 knots. Maine served in the Atlantic for the entirety of her career with the North Atlantic Fleet, which later became the Atlantic Fleet. During her early years of service, she was the fleet flagship until she was replaced in 1907. Later that year, she joined the crews of the Great White Fleet, though her heavy coal consumption prevented her from continuing with the fleet past San Francisco. After returning to the U.S., she served as the 3rd Squadron flagship during the Americans' participation in World War I from April 1917 to November 1918. Maine was used as a training ship. She remained in active service until May 1920, when she was decommissioned. The ship was ultimately sold for scrap in January 1922 and broken up for scrap under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty signed that year. The USS Maine was 393 feet 11 inches long overall and had a beam of 72 feet 3 inches and a draft of 24 feet 4 inches. She displaced 12,846 long tons as designed and up to 13,700 long tons at full load. The ship was powered by a 2-shaft triple expansion steam engines rated at 16,000 indicated horsepower and 24 coal-filled boilers, generating a top speed of 18 knots. As built, she was fitted with heavy military masts, but these were quickly replaced by cage masts in 1909. She had a crew of 561 officers and enlisted men, which increased to 779 to 813 crew members. The ship was armed with a main battery of four 12-inch 40 caliber guns in two twin gun turrets on the center line, one forward and one aft. The secondary battery consisted of 16 6-inch 50 caliber Mark VI guns, which were placed in casemates in the hull. For close-range defense against torpedo boats, she carried 6 3-inch 50 caliber guns mounted in casemates along the sides of the hull, 8 3-pounder guns, and 6 1-pounder guns. As a standard for capital ships for the period, Maine carried two 16-inch torpedo tubes submerged in her hull on the broadside. Maine's main armor belt was 16 inches thick over the magazines and the machinery specs and 8 inches everywhere else. The main battery gun turrets had 12-inch thick faces, and the supporting barbers had the same thickness of the armor platings of their exposed side. Armor that was 6 inches thick protected the second battery. The conning tower had 10-inch thick sides. Service history. Maine was built by the William Cramp Sons shipyards in Philadelphia. Her keel was laid down on February 15, 1899. The ship was launched July 27, 1901, and commissioned into the fleet on December 29, 1902. Maine operated with the North Atlantic Fleet starting in 1903. Over the next 4 years, she took part in various peacetime training exercises in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. During this period, she also steamed to the Mediterranean. She served as the flagship of Rear Admiral Robert D. Evans, and on April 16, 1907, Evans transferred his flag to the newly commissioned battleship Connecticut. Maine's next significant action was the cruise of the Great White Fleet around the world, which started with a naval review for President Theodore Roosevelt in the Hampton Roads. On December 17th, the fleet steamed out of Hampton Roads and cruised south to the Caribbean, and then to South America, making stops in Port of Spain, Rio de Janeiro, Punta Arenas, and Valparaiso, among other cities. Having arrived in Mexico in March 1908, the fleet spent 3 weeks conducting gunnery practice. The fleet then resumed its voyage up to the Pacific coast of the Americas, stopping in San Francisco. where Maine was detached from the rest of the fleet. The ship's boilers had proved to be badly inefficient, requiring excessive amounts of coal to keep up with the fleet. The battleship Alabama also left the fleet, owing to a cracked cylinder head. Maine and Alabama crossed the Pacific independently, via Guam and the Philippines. After steaming through the Indian Ocean, they transited the Suez Canal and cruised the Mediterranean. They crossed the Atlantic and arrived back on the east coast of the United States in October 1908, well ahead of the rest of the Great White Fleet. Following their arrival, Maine was assigned as the flagship of the 3rd Squadron Atlantic Fleet and operated off the east coast for several months. On February 14th, Maine and the new battleships New Hampshire, Mississippi, and Idaho, 2 armored cruisers and 2 scout cruisers, were organized to meet the returning Great White Fleet. Maine and the rest of the squadron, under the command of Rear Admiral Conway Arnold, steamed out of the Atlantic and rendezvoused with the Great White Fleet on February 17th. The combined fleet arrived in Hampton Roads on the 22nd, where a large naval review was held for President Theodore Roosevelt to celebrate their journey. On August 31, 1909, the ship was temporarily decommissioned at Portsmouth, North Hampshire. She returned to service on June 15, 1911, for duty with the Atlantic Fleet. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, entering World War I. During the war, Maine was employed as a training ship for the engine room personnel, armored guards for the merchant ships, and midshipmen from the United States Naval Academy. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed the armistice that ended the conflict. Maine participated in a naval review held in New York on December 26 to celebrate the Allied victory. At the time, most of the battleships of the Atlantic Fleet were used as transports to ferry American soldiers back from France. Maine and her sister ships were not so employed, however, owing to their short range and small size, which would not permit sufficient additional accommodations. Maine instead remained on the East Coast with the Atlantic Fleet. On May 15, 1920, she was decommissioned at the Philadelphia Naval Yard and was reclassified as BB-10 on July 17th. She was kept laid up for a year and a half before being sold on January 23, 1922 to J.G. Hittner and W.F. Collier of Philadelphia to be broken up as scrap. By December 17, 1923, she had been disarmed in accordance with the Washington Naval Treaty, which mandated significant reductions in naval strength. Maine was then scrapped. Thank you for watching the history of the USS Maine. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Share your thoughts on this ship or any others. New episodes every Saturday morning at 6 o'clock. Have a good weekend.